Hey everybody. In this lecture we're going to talk about Puritan religious views. We've already talked about the Protestant Reformation and went back to Europe in the 1500s and 1600s and talked a bit about the religious context that the Puritans were going to come out of. But in this lecture we're going to get in a lot more detail about the specifics of Puritan religious belief. The book you're reading, Kenneth Lockridge's A New England Town, Lockridge is doing more what we would call social history. He's talking about the rise of the town and the daily lives of the people that lived there. And so he doesn't get super deep into talking about the specific nature of Puritan religious views. And so that's what this lecture is going to help us with, to get a better sense of this thing that was so very important to these people. So some of the central ideas we're going to focus on here is the Puritan belief in man's evil nature. We're going to talk about their belief in God's all-powerful nature, their notion of predestination, the centrality of the Bible to the Puritans, and also their understanding of the nature of religious conversion. Okay, I'm going to get into specific detail about all those things here in a second. But that's what we're going to be doing in this lecture. All right. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the Puritan belief in man's evil nature, that man was born evil. Now, with this and also the next thing we're going to be discussing, some of you that are either Christians or know things about Christianity might be wondering, well, wow, don't all Christians believe that? Yeah, they do. Some more so, some less so. But the idea of man's evil nature is kind of Christianity 101. It's one of the central tenets. But what's going to differentiate the Puritans and some other Christians, particularly of the time, was how strongly they believed in that, the extremity to which they took the conclusion that man was evil. All right. So let's begin here with why Christians in general, and specifically the Puritans, believed man was evil. For some of you that, again, are either Christian or know things about Christianity, you know this, but others don't. So that's why I'm going to spend some time talking about this. Where does the concept of man's inherent evil come from? Well, it goes back to the story in the Bible from the first book in Genesis of Adam and Eve. In the beginning, God created the world and everything within it. And the thing he was most proud of that he had created was man, was Adam and Eve. And it was his most precious thing in the world. And he loved them so much, he placed them in this garden, the Garden of Eden, which was a paradise that had everything people could desire. It was not only bountiful in terms of food and resources, but there was a kind of perfect contentment to this place. There was no death, there was no suffering, there was no sadness. And perhaps most important of all, there was a closeness between God and man in the Garden of Eden, that Adam and Eve had this kind of intimacy with God, that God would visit every day. They would talk, they would have discussions. God was available to them. Now, within this paradise, God had placed one restriction on Adam and Eve. There was one tree within the Garden of Eden that they were supposed to leave alone and not take the fruit of. This was the tree of good and evil. And God warned them, do not take of that tree or you will die. Well, Satan, wanting to disrupt God's plan, decided to go and tempt Adam and Eve. And so he took the form of a serpent and went and approached Eve and told her, hey, you know why God doesn't want you to mess with the tree of good and evil? It's because if you take of that tree, you will gain the knowledge and know everything God knows. Essentially, you will be like God. Hey, you know why God doesn't want you to mess with that tree? The man's trying to keep you down. So you should take from that tree. Eve takes it, takes a bite, gives it to Adam. Adam takes a bite, and immediately things start to change. They now feel fear. They now feel pain. They now feel suffering. They now feel shame. God ejects them from the Garden of Eden, and all of the problems and the sufferings and the limitations of life in this earth begin. This is the Christian interpretation. This act of Adam and Eve taking from the tree of knowledge, eating that fruit, is the original sin. It is the first sin. And what made this sin different than all later sins that humans would partake of is this sin of Adam and Eve would mark all future humans. This is why man is evil. Man is evil because Adam and Eve sinned against God's will in the Garden of Eden. So that's the Christian story of why man is evil. Now, this then gets back to, okay, well, what's so special about the Puritan interpretation of this? It's how extreme they took this. Some Christians, when they talk about, well, man's evil, they're often thinking of other people, or they're thinking of little sins that they commit. But for the Puritans, man was deeply sinful. The worst thing anybody else has ever committed, that is within you. That is within me. We are all deeply, deeply sinful. Right? And so the first issue is just how strongly they sort of believed this. Right? So man's evil nature was one of the things. After I talk about the next couple things, I'm going to tie some things together, and we'll get back to man's evil nature in a second. But let's move on to the next issue. All right, God's all-powerful nature. Again, it kind of just sounds like Christianity 101. Don't all Christians believe it? Yes, but the Puritans took an implication from this. Okay. They believed God was all-powerful. However, the Puritans believed this so strongly that it led them to the conclusion that man does not possess free will. Because if God is truly all-powerful, that would mean God makes all choices. He makes all decisions. It's not up to you. God predetermined everything. I just tapped on that. Felt to me like that was my decision to do that. But God is all powerful. It was God's decision that I would do that. All right? There is no free will on this issue. God controls everything. Okay. This debate between free will and God's all-powerful nature has been going on for a long time in debates about Christianity. Most contemporary Christians resolve this by just kind of viewing it as a kind of mystery that we don't know. On the one hand, they believe God is all-powerful. On the other hand, they also believe, despite God's all-powerful nature, He does grant us free will to make our own decisions. It's a mystery. You know, when you die, if you go to heaven, Christians believe, God will explain it to you then. But not for the Puritans. The Puritans believed that in God's all-powerful nature so strongly, it led them to believe you don't have free will. Everything is predetermined. Okay. Now, when you put these first two things together, when you put together this idea that man is evil, really evil, and God is all powerful and determines everything. It leads you to probably the most famous concept that we associate with Puritan religious belief, and that is the idea of predestination. Okay. The Puritans themselves did not invent this idea of predestination, and there were other contemporary Christians at the time that also believed it. The person we most associate with the idea of predestination was a French religious figure by the name of John Calvin. He was trained as a lawyer, but would spend most of his life thinking about religious faith. Calvin took these ideas of man's inherent evil nature and God's all-powerful nature, and it led him to the conclusion that because of these, there must be predestination. Okay, so what is predestination? Predestination is the idea that before you were born, God had determined who will go to heaven and who will go to hell. And nothing you do in this world will change that fate. No matter how good you are, no matter how faithful you are, if God has predetermined you are going to go to hell, that was decided before you were born. He is all-powerful. If God is truly all-powerful, He is the one that decides that. And why is that okay? Because all men are evil. They are truly evil. We are all deserving of damnation. We deserve it. And so the fact that God spared some was a sign of His loving nature. We all deserve to go to hell. We're all truly evil. See, this is where the Puritans, taking some of their ideas from John Calvin and others, we're taking these concepts to their sort of extreme conclusions here. Okay, and so a little later on, we'll talk about the idea of conversion, because they did have some idea. Well, actually, let's take a look at that now. It's one of the later slides. Let's take a look at this. All right. So the Puritan understanding of conversion. The Puritans did talk about conversion, and they thought it happened in 5 stages. Okay. And they had a name for each of these. All right. So the first stage, election. This happened before a person was born. This is when God decided at the beginning of creation who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell. This happened before you were born. All right? And so some were elected and some were not. All right? And so the rest of these stages only pertain to people that were elected to go to heaven. All right? So if you were one of the elect, it was decided before time began, you're going to heaven. The second stage, vocation, would happen during your life. This was a kind of preparation, a preparatory stage in your life where God would be getting you ready for the change that's about to happen. Right? It was a change He directed, not that you chose. He knew it was going to happen, and He would start making it to happen. And so this was sort of getting you ready. The next thing that's going to happen is going to be very dramatic and shocking. And so the idea is he kind of had to get you ready for this. Now, the third stage was justification. This was the exact moment your sins were forgiven. This is the exact moment that God cleansed your soul. And it would have been a dramatic moment. That's why you needed that second stage, vocation, to sort of get you ready for what's happening. In the second stage, you would feel like something's going on with my life. I feel like God is working in my life, until the exact moment, justification, where your actual sins were forgiven. Puritans sometimes wrote about this experience in terms of actually feeling lighter, as if their sins were weighing them down, and that they felt physically lighter. Okay. Now, a question you might be having is like, well, when did this happen in your life? At what stage? It could vary with people. It happened to some people when they were very young. It happened to other people in middle age. It literally happened to some people on their deathbed. Right? So it could happen at any point of your life. And again, I keep emphasizing this because it's easy to lose track of this. But the Puritans understood this conversion as happening not because an individual chose to go through these stages, but because God had predetermined this. He knew it was going to happen when you were young, or when you were middle age, or when you were on your deathbed. If you weren't elected to go to heaven, you couldn't make this happen. Okay. The fourth stage, sanctification, is how you lived your life afterwards. Once your sins were forgiven, you should live your life a different way. You should be better than you were before. And so the people in your life should have been able to tell if you had gone through these previous stages. Because after your sins were forgiven, you did not become perfect. You are still evil. You are still marked by man's evil nature. But because of God's forgiveness, you're better now. Better equipped to resist sin. Not perfect, but better. And people should have been able to notice this in your life, to be able to pick up on this. Right? And so the fourth stage of sanctification was sort of how you lived your life after your sins were forgiven. And you would be noticeably a better person, better able to resist sin. Not perfect, but better able to resist sin. The fifth stage is after you died, you went to heaven. So the first stage happened before you were born. This fifth stage, glorification, happened after you die. This is when you find out if it was really true that you had gone through all these earlier stages you felt like you had gone through. So fifth stage is glorification. Okay, so this is how the Puritans understood conversion. Okay, but remember, unlike the way most contemporary Christians would think about conversion as an act of choice, you have free will, you choose to accept the Lord and ask for forgiveness. The Puritans believed this came down from God. He had predetermined and offered this only to some people that were of his elect. Now, let's talk about this concept of visible saints. This idea of visible saints, and Lockridge talks about this in your book, was the belief that visible saint was the designation Puritans gave to other Puritans that they believed were among the elect, those people who'd gone through conversion, that were selected by God to go to heaven. Right? If you believed your father was one of the elect, if he talked about going through these stages of conversion, if he is now living a sanctified life in which he seemed better than he was before, you would call your father, he's a visible saint. Okay. Does that mean there was a 100% guarantee that he was going to go to heaven? No, you're an evil sinner in this world. You had no power to designate your father to go to heaven. Only God could do that. So this was a best guess amongst other people. We think he's going to heaven. He seems like he's gone through the stages of conversion. He's talked about when his sins were forgiven. He could talk about in vivid detail. He lives his life better. We think he is among the elect. That's what a visible saint was. It was a person believed to be going to heaven. Did it guarantee it? No. You could be wrong, and the Puritans were the first ones to be able to tell you, hey, maybe we're wrong about this. Maybe you're not going to heaven. But it seems like you are. As we'll see, the designation of being called a visible saint will be important. It's gonna grant certain privileges in the town, specifically in the church. The next thing we're going to talk about is the creation of the church in Denham, and visible saints were granted certain status in the church. Now, the concept of visible saint is going to be also important, because I suspect some of you have a question that's typical when it comes to this idea of predestination. If people are predetermined to go to heaven and to go to hell, does that mean you could do anything you want in this world? Could you kill? Could you steal? Could you commit adultery against your spouse? Why not? If everything's predetermined, why not go ahead and do those things? Well, theoretically, the Puritans would tell you, theoretically, yes, you could do all those things. It was already predetermined. You could. But in practical terms, the Puritans would argue, no, that's probably not the way you're going to go about and do things. One, even though there was no reward for the Puritans for good behavior in terms of earning your way into heaven, you should still want to follow God's will. You should still want to please God. In fact, doing things to please God, just to sort of buy your way into heaven, isn't very noble from the Puritan perspective. So even if you suspect you might be going to hell, you should still want to avoid evil, sinful behavior and do the right thing. You should want to do that. But second, and this is where we get to that, remember we talked about the fourth stage of conversion, sanctification, how you lived your life after? What the Puritans would say, could you murder and steal and commit adultery and still go to heaven? Yeah, theoretically, but probably not. Because if your sins have truly been forgiven, if you'd gone through that third stage of your soul being cleansed by God, if you're living your life afterwards, you're not going to want to do those things. And because of God's forgiveness, you should be more resistant to the temptation to murder, or the temptation to steal, or the temptation to cheat on your spouse. So, is it theoretically possible you could do whatever you want and go to heaven? Yeah, but if you were doing those kinds of things, the Puritans would interpret that as a sign that you're probably not one of the elect. And so for Puritans hoping to be among the elect, they wouldn't want to engage in those behaviors. Does that mean murder never happened, or theft or adultery never happened? No. It did. But the Puritans were resistant to those things precisely because they wanted to believe they were one of the elect. So predestination didn't give just a free pass to go crazy and do whatever you want. All right, so that's conversion, predestination, all right, visible saints. Let's talk about one more thing, the importance of the Bible, the centrality of the Bible. Through most of earlier Christian history, the vast majority of Christians were illiterate. Right? And so the idea of Christians outside of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church reading the Bible was practically impossible. You know, most people outside of the hierarchy of the church were illiterate, so they didn't read the Bible. And not only was there a problem of literacy, but within the Catholic Church, even amongst those that might be literate, there was a disinclination to encourage people to read the Bible Because as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, the Bible was a very complicated text. It was hard to understand. And their fear was for untrained individuals, they would misinterpret the Bible. They would come to odd and novel interpretations, even heretical interpretations, by not understanding the Bible. So from the Catholic perspective, it was the responsibility of the Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, from the Pope to cardinals to bishops to local priests, to read and interpret the Bible and explain it to their largely illiterate parishioners. Right? And so within Catholic tradition, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on individuals reading and understanding and interpreting the Bible. By the time we're getting into the 1500s, the printing press has been invented, dramatically reducing the cost of the printed word. And we also start to see a significant rise of literacy. Among many of the Protestant denominations that start breaking away from the Catholic Church, many of them started to emphasize the responsibility of the individual Christian believer to read and understand the Bible on their own. That was your responsibility. This is where the Puritans would come down. This is one of the reasons why literacy rates are going to be so high in Puritan New England, because reading was not simply a matter of getting a good job. It didn't really matter much. These were mostly farmers. You didn't need to be able to read to be a subsistent farmer. It was about religious devotion. You were required to be literate so you could read the Bible to understand the will of God. All right? This is something we see with Martin Luther that we talked about before, John Calvin. This emphasis on making sure the individual believer reads and understands the Bible is something that's going to be very important for the Puritans. All right? So that's about enough for this lecture. We wrap it up. And when we come back, and the next thing we'll talk about is the creation of the church. And we're not done talking about some of these concepts: visible saints, conversion, predestination. So if all of these things aren't perfectly clear, try not to worry too much about it right now. We will continue to talk about these things and explore them in the lives of the people that lived in Denham. Okay? All right, everybody, take care. See you next time.